Professor Guesnerie?
Okay, I should talk about the crisis on the economic theory. I suppose it's modern economic theory from what I saw in the picture. So many economists, though not all, would agree that the recent 2008 crisis I raise question about the present state of economic theory. By economic theory, I mean maybe mainstream economic theory, formalized economic theory, the one I know better, and that it signals some kind of economic theory failure. Okay. Going somewhat further, I belong to the group of those who believe that economic theory has a key responsibility in the occurrence of the financial crisis, which triggered the global economic crisis. Okay. The bottom line is really that we economists have provided an overly optimistic view of the working of financial markets. For example, the repeated emphasis on the efficient market hypothesis is a most spectacular and well-known example of this. And such an over-optimistic view as within a group, the practitioners of the financial sector, which is a group already prone to self-confidence and reluctant to regulation, that has triggered the deployment of uncontrolled imagination. So the previous acceptance of exaggeratedly optimistic conclusion, either in finance or macroeconomics, has reflected, among others, some critical, uncritical acceptance of modeling principles, which were incorrectly given the status of unquestionable axioms. At least that's one direction of reflection, and the one I want to go into here. And I want to raise some of the questions that concern methodological problems that have been raised after the crisis. First line of criticism, the rationality hypothesis. Okay. Real economic agents do not resemble too much to the Homo economicus of formal economic theory. This point has been made repeatedly by many people. If you read Paul Krugman in the New York Times, you will see that done many times. Okay, we have our view of rationality is certainly too simplistic. In fact, there has been a lot of work along this direction. Behavioral economics has attempted to think more about this problem. In a sense, what my predecessor said is relates with the criticism, maybe not of the rationality of Homo economicus, but the way we treat information in our model. There is another point I want to raise, and that's the one I want to go into, is the second line of criticism, it's expectational coordination. After the Second World War, and particularly after the 60s, what is called the rational expectation hypothesis has taken over progressively most fields of economic modeling, okay, going from microeconomics, general equilibrium, macroeconomics, last but not least finance and so on, trade, etc. The rise of the rational expectation hypothesis follows an article by John Moose in the early 60s, who argued that economic agents refer to the relevant economic theory. By relevant, it means that their theory is as good as the theory of economists. Okay. Naturally, the success of the hypothesis may be due to the semantic option. It's uncomfortable for economists to feel irrational. And it seems that a generation of economists, as at least in majority, believe that, I quote, the rational expectation is nothing else than the extension of the rationality hypothesis to expectation. Naturally, this is strictly speaking wrong. It's rational to have rational expectation only when the other agents have rational expectations. Okay. It's not a dominant strategy. It's a Nash equilibrium in game theoretical terms. But in an economic situation involving many interacting optimizing agents, a rational expectation equilibrium outcome appears as a kind of focal point which is associated with the idea of successful coordination of expectation. Indeed, it's an hypothesis, rational expectation hypothesis, but in practice has most often been transformed into an unavoidable and, in a sense, unquestionable modeling axiom. In fact, in the literature, there has been, in the literature I know better, okay, modern economic theory, there have been many directions of critical assessment of the rational expectation hypothesis. I will use Marxist-like terminology of my youth to classify this direction in two groups: internal criticism and external criticism. Okay. Internal criticism accepts the hypothesis, but point to unpleasant conclusion. Okay, initially, the rational expectation hypothesis is justified by the fact that agents refer to the relevant economic theory. What if there are several relevant economic theories? Okay, if you have multiplicity of equilibria. There has been a literature in the 80s in which I have been associated, showing, for example, that in simple worlds you could have sunspot equilibria, which is a continuous multiplicity of equilibria. Under the same heading, I will put works on global games, although it puts emphasis on the role information for getting uniqueness or multiplicity. The literature on herd behavior, which is associated with somebody you talk about, which is Mr. Banerjee, but in a different context, obviously. That's for internal criticism. External criticism amounts to question the plausibility of the hypothesis. For example, it's an old tradition, what is called real-time learning. You look at the system, and you model the agents as people who learn from the past. Okay, they change their view of the future by looking at the present and at the past. And you look at whether the process, this learning process, converge. Okay. If it converges, that's an argument for the equilibrium, the rational expectation equilibrium. If it does not converge, then there's an argument against. Okay. There are different ways to deal with this. For example, I've been involved in assessing the robustness of rational expectation equilibrium, the fact that they are rational in a deep sense. Okay. And assessing the robustness amounts to assess whether the realization, what happens, is very sensitive to the expectation, what you think about the world. Okay. When it's not very sensitive, you may believe that the convention that is associated with that is stable. When it's very sensitive, you should not believe that this convention is very stable. Okay. But there are different ways to go into this direction as suggests. Roman Friedman, who will talk in another direction in a moment, Mordecai Kurz that developed the idea of diverse belief and so on. Now, reconsidering the rational expectation hypothesis as spectacular consequence, I will offer a few examples that are drawn from my work or from work from colleagues close with similar inspiration. First example, very briefly. Is speculation stabilizing? Along the line of Milton Friedman's argument. Okay, he argued very strongly that speculation was stabilizing. If you look at this question in a simple world for me is a simple model, one can see that Friedman is right in a sense. Speculation decreases the variance of the equilibrium price, of the rational expectation equilibrium price. but it's destabilizing in another sense. The new and apparently better equilibrium after you introduce speculators is less plausible, is less robust in the sense of the analysis here. Second example, do prices transmit well information in financial markets? That relate with the efficient market hypothesis. Okay. There is a large literature on variety of answers. If you introduce in the analysis the requirement that I like, of the type I like, you conclude, in fact, that information can be transmitted by prices only when there is not too much information to transmit. When there is too much information to transmit, the equilibrium is fragile. Okay. I could explain the intuition behind, but I suppose I am rather late, so I should go a little bit further. I could go on along this line. For example, long-term coordination, as assumed in real business cycles, that based on the fact that people have a view of the future up to infinity, okay, is extraordinarily fragile along the line of the criteria I am discussing. So here is for rational expectation hypothesis. Let me leave at this stage the methodological discussion and come to two other transversal questions and controversial questions relating to the state of economic theory. The first one is Balkanization. In the last 40 years, there has been a considerable amount of work in the field of economics, and I believe a considerable production of knowledge. Large and new territory have been explored. These are the good news. What are the bad news? The bad news is that this has gone together with Balkanization of the field. Fronts have been multiplied, but inside progress on each front is less and less well understood by outsiders. And naturally, this is more a problem in a social science, where we need to understand the system as a whole, than in natural sciences, where Balkanized knowledge is more, has less inconveniences. My second parenthesis is on the role of mathematical tools, which you told. The use of mathematical tools has been promoted by the learning society, the econometric society, which was a very small minority group in the 30s, and the intellectual program of which has, in a sense, a triumph over the 70s, something like that, 80s. Okay. Although after its triumph, it may have to be reconsidered. Okay. This reflects the fact that, as we know, Capitol Hill is not far from the Tarpeian Rock. What can be said against modeling? First, you have to distinguish between statistical knowledge, statistical tools. I suppose nobody will disagree that we should use the best statistical tools that we have, and mathematical modeling. Okay. What can be said against modeling? Modeling has an obvious inconvenience. It increases the entry cost in the intellectual discussion. In some cases, you may say it's an advantage, but on the whole, it's rather an inconvenience. I agree with that. Second, I would not deny that the rationality hypothesis, I was criticizing, the rational expectation hypothesis make economic modeling easier. And that this may explain the popularity of these two assumptions. However, I don't believe that the critical assessment of rationality and the rational expectation hypothesis requires to abandon modeling. In a sense, I don't think we should throw out the baby as well as the bathwater. Rigor is a basic need, not a luxury. The adoption of the mathematical language has been historically instrumental in fighting geographical and ideological balkanization. Also, let us remind that in economics and social sciences, erroneous arguments are not so easily refuted by facts. But it's clear that the fighting Balkanization, inside economic theory and Balkanization of economic theory requires a much better interaction between basic empirical knowledge and scholarly investigation, between specialists, historians, I would say historians of economic thought. And I think personally that the history of economic thought is absolutely a stimulating field for me as a theorist. I come back to the question on rational expectation hypothesis. Why should we abandon it? Okay. It turns out that I'm coordinating an international network on expectational coordination that is, in fact, financed by INET, and would gather many different nodes, either in geographical terms. It goes from Stanford, Princeton, New York, Jerusalem, Beijing, Tokyo, Zurich, Amsterdam, as well as in intellectual terms. And people in the network certainly disagree on the answer to be given to the above question. Some think that we should be extremely cautious in re-evaluating the rational expectation hypothesis. Others think that we should give it up immediately. Hence, they disagree, but they agree to disagree, and I hope this will turn out into a fruitful confrontation. Personally, I have mixed feelings. I personally believe that the fact that the rational expectation hypothesis is equally reasonable across situations, which is an axiom generally accepted by a majority of my colleagues, is entirely unreasonable. I think rational expectation hypothesis may be reasonable for understanding some phenomena and totally unreasonable for understanding others. But actually, the reluctance of the profession to give up the rational expectation hypothesis has deep roots. It reflects its attachment to philosophical determinism, which has shaped the development of our field, and I will say all schools of thought together. Outside the rational expectation territory, which is a discipline territory, there is a wilderness of non-rational expectation worlds. How to explore this territory? Ike, that will be presented in a moment by Roman, is one direction. The world of diverse belief, of course, is another direction. They provide roadmaps. I have my own roadmap, but it's not the place, and we have not the time to go into comparison. I just want to conclude by stressing that the exploration of this territory, I think we should really explore it, should lead hopefully to a sounder knowledge, but also probably to a more modest knowledge.